So today we're going to continue the concept of orthographic projection of points, but today we're no longer living in a perfectly square world. We're going to have some auxiliary views for angled surfaces. So just a recap of a few of the things that we talked about last time, that we have our 6 principal views, and I want to remind you on the classification of those views that we have horizontal planes, those being the top and the bottom of the box. And then the vertical planes are our elevations. So the front, left, right, and back. So if you want to think of it as a house, we always call them elevation views when we're looking at each wall of the house. So that'll come into play today and especially the next couple of classes as well, the difference between a horizontal and an elevation. Make sense? Okay. Then I hit on this very briefly at the end of class, but it's going to come again into play a little more today, and that is this idea of adjacent views and related views. And adjacent views are just simply 2 views that are connected to each other. And then related views are 2 views that share the same intermediate view. They're both connected to the same view. And what's important about that, especially for what we're going to do today, is that those views share the same coordinate distance. So if we again talk about what we looked at last time, we're really focusing on these 3 views. So these 2 views are adjacent views, these 2 views are adjacent views. Horizontal and profile both share the same intermediate view, so therefore these are related views. So that means any spacing in this view is true in this view as well, in terms of its relationship to the view that they share. So what we talked about then the other day was that if it's 10 millimeters back from the front plane, then it's 10 millimeters this way, and it's 10 millimeters this way. So that distance transfers. And if I had the bottom, I do have the bottom, then that distance is going to be the same. If I've got the left side, these are all hinged to the front, so that 10 millimeters would be here, it would be here, it would be here, it would be here. Does that make sense? And that's important because today, I'm not just going to give you the 10 millimeter value. I might have a point over here, and you need to locate it over here. So you're going to have to come over here and measure what this distance is, and then apply it over here. So that idea that, the other way I like to think of it too, that I think sometimes helps students, is go back 2 views. So you're in this view, I can go back 2 views to figure out the spacing. That could be 1, 2, it could be 1, 2, it could be 1, 2. It would be the same in each situation. So we'll see that in action more in just a little bit, but just wanted to hit on that again because it's pretty important for what we're going to talk about today. And then of course there is the slide here that shows something very similar, if this will get into slideshow view. That's better. Okay. So again, we talked about all of that. There's a view of it on the slides. I want to remind you that the slides are in Learning Zone. I also want to, I'll point out later a couple of other helpful things that are in Learning Zone as well. So today we're going to talk about auxiliary views. So like I said, we're no longer in this perfectly cubed world. We have shapes that have angles on them. And so we're going to take a look at how to find points in those views. So functionally we'll be doing the same thing that we did last time. We're just going to be doing them in different views. Our hinges won't necessarily be vertical or horizontal anymore. They'll be going different ways. And we basically have 2 different types of auxiliary views. We have what we call auxiliary elevation views and auxiliary incline views. Let me talk about those for just a second. So switch gears here again. So again, we don't always have perfectly square objects, so perhaps this is my object, and this is the top view of my object. Here are the elevations around the sides. So this would be the top view, right? This would be the front view, left profile, the back view. This thing wouldn't be the side profile. The side profile is only if it's got a vertical line here, right, projecting to the side view. If I did create a side view, it's going to be foreshortened. Right, I can't see the actual true shape of that. It's sloping away from me. So it really doesn't tell me anything. So what I want instead is I want to see the full view of this shape, so I basically want to unfold it like so. So that's going to give me a hinge that is not horizontal or vertical, and the resulting view then will be an auxiliary view. So anything that is not one of the 6 principal planes is an auxiliary view. Make sense so far? So as I talked about the cube a while ago, I mentioned that I have horizontal planes on the top and bottom, and then everything else that's vertical is an elevation. So as I look at this one, here's the top, it's horizontal. This is vertical, it's an elevation. So's this, so's this, so's this one, right? This is vertical. So this is an auxiliary elevation view. And the way that you easily recognize if something is an auxiliary elevation is if it's hinged off of the top view. If it's hinged off of the horizontal view, then by default that means we're basically taking this flat plane, folding this down 90. This is a vertical wall. So if I change this part a little bit and I told you that this is the top of the part, now this is an elevation, this is an elevation, this is an elevation. This isn't vertical anymore, right? So it's not an elevation. So anytime you have an auxiliary view that is hinged off of another view, such as a front or a side view, it's called an auxiliary inclined plane. Which makes sense because this is an inclined plane, right? It's not a vertical plane, it's inclined. So the quick, fast rule is it's an auxiliary elevation if it's hinged off of the top. If it's hinged off of the front or the profile, then it is simply an auxiliary inclined view. And that concept will get more important as we go along, especially when we get into lines and we start talking about slopes and things like that. But are there any questions so far just on that idea? All right, let's switch back to my computer here. There we go. Okay, so in order to find our auxiliary projections of our points, the first thing we're going to do is lay out the principal views. So most of the time our 3 views, our front, our profile, and our horizontal. So this is what we did last class period. Again, the idea of the related views, this space, how far away from the front plane is it, is the same as it is right here. So once I've got all those, then I might have an auxiliary view. And again, to kind of help you picture this auxiliary view that I'm dealing with there, you're basically dealing with something that looks a little bit like this. This is your horizontal plane. If I were to fold it, this would be the top, this would be the front. This is an auxiliary elevation, right? It's vertical, and it's hinged off of the horizontal. This is kind of what we're dealing with in this picture. There we go. So let me back up just a second here. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you choose a pin here. Hopefully it'll let me. And let's do red. Okay. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we didn't know this point yet, AH. And I gave you only these 2 points, AF and AP. You have enough to find AH. Because remember what we talked about the other day, that in the front view, I can see the X value and the Z value. And in the side view, I can also see the Z value, but I can see the Y value as well. So I've got my X, Y, and Z. So I can find point AH if I didn't already know where it's at. And the way that I do that, and the way that we're going to do just about every point in this class, is we start in the adjacent view. So again, just pretend like this thing is not there yet. And I tell you what, I'm not very good at pretending, so let me see if I can get rid of this dude here. There we go. Good enough. All right, so that point doesn't exist, right? So we need to find it. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to start in the adjacent view, and I'm going to project this point straight into the next view. And straight into the next view basically means perpendicular to this hinge. So right now it's going to be vertical, but when I get auxiliary views, it's not going to be vertical. So I'll tell you ahead of time, this line's going to be bad. Let's pretend it's nice and vertical though, right? Okay. So it's going to go straight up. And this is where we're going to use the ray. Remember I said we're going to be using the ray a lot in this class? we're going to use array to go from here into the next view. Then the question I'm asking is how far behind the front plane is this point? And so I'm going to go back 2 views to figure that out. I'm going to go back 1 view, 2 views, and whatever this space is, I'm going to use my offset command basically to figure out that space, and then offset this hinge up, and then where they meet, that's going to be point AH. Does that make sense so far? If that does, amazing, because we're just going to do that over and over and over and over and apply it different ways and do lines and planes, but that concept we're just going to do over and over again in this class. So if I'm in this view now, and I now have AH, and I want to find A1 up here, once more I'm going to start in this adjacent view, and I'm going to project straight across this hinge, which means functionally in AutoCAD, I'm going to draw a ray from here perpendicular to this hinge. Whoa, that was bad. Whew. So that's perpendicular, right? And then now I'm in this view, and I'm going to go back 2 views to find my space. So I'm going to go back 1 view, 2 views. And the space that I want to find is this space right here. Don't measure this space over here. That has nothing to do with the direction I'm coming from. So you measure from the hinge that you're coming from. Because again, what I'm saying is, here's H. Point A is this far away from the horizontal plane. So here's H. It's also going to be that far away from the horizontal plane. So again, functionally in AutoCAD, we're going to offset, figure out what this distance is, offset this hinge, and where they meet, there will be my point. So let's see that with straight lines, shall we? So there the line is going across perpendicularly. And then again, I'm going back 2 views to find my offset distance down here. That one went a little fast. Doesn't really have, I guess it didn't show the projected line. But again, we're going back 2 views. Whatever this distance is, we're going to offset this line up. That'll give me my line, and then where they meet, there's the point. So is this, yeah, I said it again already, but is this an auxiliary incline or an auxiliary elevation? Elevation. So if it's hinged, you can't see it up there, but remember, if it's hinged off of the horizontal, and that means that it is going to be a vertical plane, so it's an elevation. If it's hinged off of the front or a side, then it's inclined, it's sloping. Got too many buttons to hit back here. Okay, so let's take a look at another example here real quick. So here is auxiliary 2. So I didn't mention this on the previous auxiliary view, but auxiliary views are just numbered. And it just, in whatever order you happen to go in, that one's auxiliary 1, so we get point A1. Now we've got auxiliary view 2, so we'll have point A2. And again, same concept. I'm going to take this point, I'm going to go perpendicular to that hinge. I'm going to go back 2 views to figure out how far away from P am I going. 1, 2. This is how far away from the P that I'm going. So whatever that distance is, I'll offset this to apply it and end up with a point somewhere out here in space. A2. So again, there's the line, and that spacing comes again from the 2 views back, this spacing right here. And then this one is inclined, since it's hinged off of the profile or the front, in this case the profile. Now sometimes that is not enough views still, so again, talked about all this. So here's an example of one more view. So in this case, same idea. Now I'm going from auxiliary 2 to 3. I take the point perpendicular across this hinge, and then I go back 2 views, 1, 2, and this spacing tells me how far away from 2 I am. So I am this far away from 2, and that finds my point.
Do you know that was an incline again?
This one over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an incline because it's hinged off of either the front or the profile. So if it's hinged off the horizontal, it's an elevation. If it's hinged off of one of these two, it's inclined. Good question. Now this one is called an oblique. So when you hinge off of another auxiliary view, it's an oblique view. Why would we do an oblique view? Let's see if I can find a good reason. Here's one. So if I take a look at this plane right here, so if this is the top of my part, say this is the front, this one would be an auxiliary incline because it slopes, right? It's not a vertical plane. If you look at this plane right here, that is a vertical plane. It shows up as an edge when I look straight down at it, but it doesn't line up with the principal planes, so that one is an auxiliary elevation. So does that make sense so far? So that one is an auxiliary incline, this one is an auxiliary elevation. This one doesn't match up with any plane at all, so it's an oblique. So it doesn't show up as an edge, it doesn't show up as an edge in one of my principal views, which this one does, and we'll talk more about that as a description of planes later when we get into them. But this plane right here, you know, no matter which way I rotate this, I'm never going to see it in an edge view. That means it's an oblique plane, and it's going to take two views to really show what this shape looks like. And that's eventually where we're going with this, is creating views that let me see the true shape of a plane so that I can fully describe it and dimension it. So that's the reason why we're doing these points and different views. Now my AutoCAD's showing up properly. Sorry about that. So again, we're going to click the New button, and then we're going to go to our Templates folder, and then the Additional Files folder, where again I usually put the ones that we're going to work on together. And in there you will find one called Auxiliary Practice. What we're going to do now is we're going to take this exercise and do it together, and you can see that in the instructions here that we have point A, and we're going to show it in each view. Point A is 17 behind the front, 12 below the horizontal, and 38 to the left of the profile plane. So before I start doing that, I want to set up my layers, and I want to set up my offset to jump into the current layer. So first of all, I'm going to change my layer to the projection lines layer. Not 100% required, but it makes it a heck of a lot easier to figure out which one are projection lines and which ones are hinge lines, and keeps you from erasing hinge lines. And then the next thing I want to do is start the offset command. And then in the command line, choose the layer option, and then choose the current option so that it offsets into that current layer. And so now it's ready for my first value. That first value, we'll say it's 17 behind the front plane. So I'm going to type in 17 and enter for my offset. Now remember, don't get hung up on to the left, behind, you know, below. Think away from. So it's 17 away from the front plane. So anywhere there's an F hinge, I'm going to go 17 away from it. So that means I'm going to take this hinge and it'll go up on screen. That's going away from the front plane. This one over here is going to go to the right because that's going away from the F. And then I've got auxiliary view 3 over here. I've got to go the same amount away from the front plane there as well. And then I can just escape to deselect that. So far so good? All right, so next up, we are told that it is 12 below horizontal. And again, don't get hung up on below, because if you look at this one, this is actually on my screen going to go above, right? It's going to go away from the H. So we're going to go offset of 12. Offset 12 and enter. So this hinge below to go away from the horizontal. This hinge this direction to go away from the horizontal plane. And then again, I'll just escape to cancel out of that. I already got one point here that I could call out, but I'll come back and do that in a few minutes. So finally, we're told that it's 38 to the left of the profile plane. Again, I'm going to think 38 away from the P. So offset 38. So here in the front view, it's going to go off to the left. But as I look at auxiliary view 5 over here, it's going to go this direction away from the profile plane. I can escape to deselect that. So now I can find my 3 principal views of this point. So where this extends up, I can find the intersection. And I'll show you a couple different ways to do that. One way, you can actually grab this line and grab its grip and drag it straight up to where it actually intersects. As long as polar tracking is turned on, you can see mine's locked on to vertical there. The other thing I can do is just an intersection override, and I'll show you that in just a second. So ready to draw my points. I'm going to do that in the point layer. So I'll click my drop down and go to points. And then you might remember you could type PO, or you could choose the draw drop down and choose the point tool from there. So first up, that point. And then I want to find the intersection of these two. There's several different ways you could do it. One way is, assuming that I've got O track turned on, I can track off of this endpoint and drag it up to where it meets, and it'll find its intersection. The other thing that you can do that I recommend you get used to doing is doing object snap overrides. And that's where you hold the shift with your left hand and right click your mouse to get a list of snaps. And then I can choose intersection. And then what I'm going to do is click on the 2 items individually. So I'll click on this line, and then I'll click on this line. And as you can see, it's going to put the point where those 2 items would intersect. Is there a point right here? No, remember that's just the space that's empty after I unfold those views. So now that I've got my 3 principal views, I'm going to go ahead and erase the construction lines that were associated with that. Now I should label these, but in the interest of time for us going through this, we won't worry about labeling them, but this would be AF, AH, and AP, right? So to find the next views, I want to project from this point into the next view. So let's say we'll do auxiliary 1 first. I want to go from this point into the next view. You could change your layer if you want. It's okay to stay in the points layer. Just for the sake of consistency, I'll draw my line in the projection lines layer. But you could stay in the points layer. So the tool we're looking for then is the ray command. So again, that's hidden under the draw menu. Draw, and then ray is in here. Now I want to snap to this point right here. And so what I'm looking for is this little snap right here, snap to node. If you're not getting snap to node, then you want to come down to your object snaps at the bottom of your screen. This little box with the green dot. Click the drop down next to it and turn on node. While you're in here, turn on perpendicular as well, because you're going to need that one too in just a moment. So we want to make sure node and perpendicular are on. By the way, you don't escape to get out of this menu, you click behind it. It's kind of weird. Okay, so everybody got those settings so far? Okay, so I've got my ray. I'm going to snap to this node, and then I am going to snap perpendicular to this hinge line. So make sure you get perpendicular, not a midpoint or some other intersection. Sometimes the tracking angle gets in the way. You're looking for perpendicular. So when I see perpendicular, again, I'm very particular. I like to see it jump, so you can hold your mouse right there, but I find great pleasure in clicking on the line and seeing it jump to perpendicular and knowing that it actually did its job. So there's my point. So now I can switch to the points layer and draw in my next point. What's wrong?
The array I made actually made layer.
That's okay. You're gonna erase it anyways. It's just a construction line. There is an auxiliary 2 that's built off of this one, but we're going to come back to that. Let's get the other 2 points that are pretty much laid out for us. So if we look at auxiliary view 3 here, we're just going to draw a ray from the front across this hinge. So again, ray, start at this node perpendicular to the hinge where those lines meet. That's our next point. And as you can see, I didn't bother changing my layers. It's extra steps that don't really need. I just really like to offset the construction lines or the hinges into a different layer because I see a lot of students erasing hinge lines on accident.
So you want the intersection or the perpendicular of that line?
It should be the intersection, but sometimes the perpendicular snap will show up instead of the intersection. As long as it's right on that point,
Okay.
you should be fine. Good question. Now again, we won't spend the time labeling since this is our quick one we're doing together, but what label would that point have? What was that? Well, you're close. 3 is the subscript, but what point are we placing? Point A? A3. So it'd be point A3. Because again, just up in the instructions here, it said it's point A. So the A3. So then let's find A5 over here. So same way, we'll draw a ray, perpendicular, and where those two meet, there's our point. Are we doing good so far? All right. Well, like I said, if you get hung up on anything, you can go back. You can ask me, of course. You can go back and look at the cheat sheet. You can also go back and look at the video. So let's go on to the oblique views. If you haven't fully created all of these, don't worry about it. You can just follow along and observe if necessary. So let's go back up here to auxiliary 1 to 2. So I'm going from auxiliary view 1 over to 2. So I'm going to create a ray from this point perpendicular to this hinge. So ray perpendicular. Now we're getting into a situation where the two auxiliary views are pretty close together, but that's okay. We'll just deal with it. So the question that I'm asking myself to find this point, I want to know how many millimeters it is away from which plane. Which plane am I coming from? Plane 1, right? So I'm trying to figure out how far away from plane 1 am I. So where else do I see a plane 1? Right here. So this is the distance I want to measure. So that's kind of the logic approach, the just step-by-step approach. Go back 2 views. I'm in this view, 1 view, 2 views to this point, and then I take this distance away from the hinge that I just was, or that I just came from. So to do that, I don't want to actually measure it. I'm going to let offset do that for me. So I'm going to choose the offset command. I'm going to pick this point, and then I'm going to pick perpendicular to this hinge. Whatever distance that was, AutoCAD just put into the offset command. I can now offset this hinge over the same distance, and I now have point A2. Again, one of the struggles early on here is we're just talking about points, but keep in mind these points are parts of a plane that's on a solid object that we'll eventually get to. So that one would be labeled point A2 then. So any questions on that before I go any further? Does that make sense what happened there? Okay. All right, so then we got one more. Auxiliary 3 to 4. So I'm going to draw a ray from this point A3, perpendicular to the hinge. So I'm in this view. I'm going to go back 2 views, 1 view, 2 views, and I'm going to measure the distance right here with the offset command. So usually the biggest problem that people make is either they measure this distance on the wrong side of the hinge, or they measure going the wrong direction, or even going that way. So it's the direction you came from. So I'll offset from this point perpendicular to this hinge, and then I'll offset this line over that distance. And that is our final point, which again we would label A4 if we were going to go to the effort to label them. And that is how we lay out auxiliary views. So one of these views, either auxiliary 5, auxiliary 3, 4, 2, or 1, one of them is an auxiliary elevation view. Can somebody tell me which auxiliary plane is an elevation view? One. So if it's hinged off of the horizontal, it's an elevation. So 2 of these are auxiliary incline views. Which are those? 5 and 3. So if they're hinged off of the front or the profile, they're inclined. 2 of them are oblique views. Those are the only ones that are left, 4 and 2. So remember, oblique means that they're hinged off another auxiliary. So elevation is hinged off of horizontal. Profiles, or excuse me, inclines are hinged off of profiles or frontal, and then obliques are hinged off of other auxiliary views. Okay, so with all that said, your job today is to do 2 exercises very similar to this one for practice. And those exercises are points 2 and points 3. So I'll show you guys both of these and so you can get started, and then I'll turn you loose. So I'm going to go to new and templates, and then points 2. So with points 2, I've given you the front and the horizontal views of 2 points, X and Y. And I strongly encourage you, do all the X's first and label them, do all the Y's and label them. Don't try to do them all at the same time. You'll end up putting points in the wrong spot. So what you don't have is any sort of values here for how far behind they are, because again, you've got everything you need here. If I want to find the profile, first thing I'm going to do is take the X straight to the right and then offset 2 views back, 1, 2. There's my offset value, there's my X. And then you can just go on from there. So you'll have all the X's and all the Y's. Make sure you label them properly, and I would strongly recommend, I don't care if you go ahead and use the text tool and don't do subscripts. You know, if this one over here would be XP, that's fine. I like to copy, so if I copy this one over, it already has the nice little subscript there. Then you just have to double click on it and edit that to be a P. I'll accept either one, but as long as you've got the label. So that's points 2. Points 3 is a little more like the one that we just did together, because I give you the values on this one instead. But again, this one has 2 points. So it's got points A and C. So do all the A's, label them, do all the C's, label them.